So yes, I said feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Great. Perfect. So I think, yeah, let's just start. So hi, my name is Diana Garduño Jimenez. I work at Nourish Scotland, mostly focusing on aquatic foods and agroecology, along with my colleague Olivia, who might be joining us today from a train. We run the work on aquatic foods at Nourish, which is a relatively new strand of work for us, as we've mostly been focusing on food produced on land. And this webinar is part of our Fish Plus in a Good Food Nation webinar series. So there will be more webinars to come on the topic if you're keen to learn about other aspects of aquatic foods in Scotland. And this series is part of our current project where we're producing what we're calling the Fish Plus Atlas. And basically, the atlas will be a publication that paints a picture of the current role of aquatic foods in Scotland's food systems. It'll be filled with infographics, case studies, and just different data of aquatic foods, just yeah, to get people a bit more acquainted with them. And so it will include things like what is fished, farmed, caught, where and by who, what the challenges and opportunities are for people working across the supply chain, the relationship between production and ecosystems, fish plus consumption patterns, fish plus processing and distribution. And then the development of this publication is being led by a steering group and many members of which are here today. It is really good to see all of you. And this steering group is made of people with from very different backgrounds and experiences. It includes young people, people working in aquaculture, fishing, local authority catering, health, nutrition, animal welfare, environmental conservation, and community restoration. Um, and they're helping, well, yeah, they're leading basically the processes. They're really the ones who are experts and know more on these topics than we do at Nourish. And this publication is really aiming to help us in Scotland make sure that Fish Plus is part of conversations for the Good Food Nation Act. And just as a reminder, or for those who don't know, the Good Food Nation Act was introduced in 2022 and is really aiming to take this approach to food that is good for people and planet. And it has this vision of a Scotland where people from every walk of life take pride and pleasure in and benefit from the food they produce, buy, cook, serve, and eat each day. And I just think that's really key for today, as we're going to be talking about fishers in the sector. And I really invite you to reflect on if we really want this vision to be a reality where producers feel this pride and pleasure in the food that they're producing, what will it take to make that happen? So I'm very excited to have here today Chris Williams and Oska Paul. And Chris Williams works at the International Transport Federation. Which is a democratic affiliate-led federation recognized as the world's leading transport authority, and it connects more than 730 affiliated trade unions from 190 different countries to secure rights, equality, and justice for workers globally. And Oska Paul, who works at Focus on Labour Exploitation, which is a workers' rights organization dedicated to identifying and transforming the systems and structures that enable labor exploitation to occur. So we're first going to hear from Chris today, and then we'll hear from Oska. And then we're just going to open up for any questions and discussions that you might have. So yeah, great. Let's get started. Chris, go for it.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I've been asked to sort of set the context globally and relate what's going on in the world seafood industry to the situation for migrant fishers. And then Oska's going to speak about some work that we collaborate on in the UK. So I'm the section coordinator for fisheries at ITF. I'm just going to briefly tell you a bit about our organization in case some of you don't know. So as you heard, the ITF is a trade union federation, or what's called a GUF, a global union federation. We have different transport sections within our federation, and fisheries is one of them. It's the smallest one because globally fishing isn't as unionized as something like seafaring or the railways worldwide, which won't surprise people to hear, but nonetheless we have 91 fishers unions affiliated to the ITF, and they represent 151,000 fishers. So that makes us the biggest representative organization for labour in fisheries globally. We also have organising projects where we're organising migrant fishers. The biggest of those is in Thailand, but we also have other projects in Indonesia, West Africa, Philippines, and Latin America. And we have a network of over 6,500 migrant fishers organised on top of that. Our section committee is made up of unions from around the world so that we can balance and combine all of those members' priorities into global strategies and global campaigns, but also to respond to our affiliates' needs based on what's going on in their country. So the first thing I'm going to do is provide a global overview of the world's fishing industry. I'm going to draw pretty heavily on the work of the UN FAO, which is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. Obviously, looking in the chat and seeing where you guys work, it's clear that obviously food, healthy food, food security are obviously things that matter. But fishing and aquaculture obviously provide more than just food. They also provide livelihoods and that kind of safety net in terms of sustenance. Seafood is also the world's most traded food commodity. And obviously, you know, that food doesn't arrive in a supermarket or in a restaurant without a long and complex supply chain based on the kind of species that people want to eat. And that means that transport workers are important and vital within that supply chain globally. So it's not just fishers that have an interest in getting that food from the sea to the consumers. A large percentage of those workers, whether it's domestic or migrant, remain fairly invisible within supply chains, and decent work, which is a #1 priority for the ITF and also the International Labour Organization. When it comes to fishing, fishing is seen globally as one of the industries with very high decent work deficits, and I can talk about that a bit later. But obviously, we're interested in sustainability. All of you will think about that from an environmental point of view, but thinking about sustainability in terms of labour is also very important. To our mind, equally important, because you can't have good jobs into the future without that being underpinned by good fisheries management. But conversely, if there's nobody there to do the work, you don't get the food or the economic benefits either. So the FAO obviously monitors information and reports from all of the member countries of the UN. You can see here millions of tons of seafood produced either through capture fisheries in light blue or aquaculture in the pink and purple. And you can see there that capture fisheries dominated the seafood making it to our plates until about the early 1990s, and since then it's kind of plateaued at around the 80 million ton mark from capture fisheries. However, total production has doubled since then, and that gap has been filled by freshwater and seawater aquaculture, which by now is actually producing more food than wild capture fisheries. So it peaked in terms of capture fisheries in 2022, and that was around 92 million tons. And obviously, there's nowhere really to go once you've reached a point where all of your fisheries are fished at their maximum level. So you can see there the alarming trend in terms of overfishing since the 1970s. It's reached a point now where around a third of stocks are overfished, but on top of that, a further close to 70% are fished at their maximum sustainable level already. So there's nowhere else to go. In terms of underfished stocks, that's not really so much of an issue because those are usually things that aren't used either by people or in agriculture. So that's a fairly alarming set of circumstances. And obviously, from a Labour perspective, we're concerned about that because if the stocks aren't there, the jobs won't follow. One major change that people need to be aware of, looking at global exports here, is that China, this includes aquaculture as well. So obviously China is a huge aquaculture producer aside from its tremendously huge global fishing fleet, but so is Norway, and Vietnam. Norway, it would be salmon. Vietnam, it would be prawns. Ecuador has a big fishing industry, but also is a big prawn producer. And the same with Chile and India, salmon and prawns again. So you can see there in terms of the production. What is really interesting in China as well is that China now is also a net importer of seafood products, despite that tremendous production and despite the population they've got. They're still reliant on seafood from elsewhere. Now, when it comes to the fleet, this is the growth of vessels. The dark purple is vessels that have a fixed engine, and the light blue is the non-motorized or kind of canoe fishing. The FAO says that over 60 million people are employed directly in the primary production, whether it's fishing or aquaculture. 90% of the workers involved are in small-scale fisheries, which, while they only produce 40% of the landings, they represent 90% of the fishers. But in terms of dependence, around 500 million people depend on small-scale fisheries for some or all of their livelihood. Now, when it comes to the workforce, you can see here a breakdown of jobs globally since the mid-90s until recently. You can see nearly 60 million people in total work in fisheries and aquaculture. 2/3 of those are in fisheries, 1/3 of those in aquaculture, because it's far more mechanized per worker. And around 21% of workers are women, usually in seafood processing or the post-harvest sectors. You can also see there that by far the majority of employment and livelihoods are in Asia, unsurprisingly, because that's also where the biggest global population is, or the biggest percentage of the world's population. When it comes to regional jobs, as I was saying before, this is the breakdown. Marine fisheries is the light blue one, so that's what we're focusing on. Asia has 84% of all of the fishers and fish farmers, Africa approximately 10%, and it's Latin America, the Caribbean, only about 4%, and then Europe, North America, and Oceania, each around 1%. So you can see that really the focus of all of this needs to be Asia, if we're thinking in kind of aggregated terms. Now, when it comes to work in fishing, there is a spectrum, like in any kind of sector, but I think in fishing it's really quite extreme, because you can have situations where there are, in some countries, you have sectoral bargaining, which means that the government and the unions and the employers meet and through a tripartite process determine what the minimum standards are for fishers across their economy and across their fleet. You also have individual unions that bargain with their employers. So those could be big fleet owners in the tuna fleet or in the squid fishery. And they would then bargain on behalf of their members to get the best terms and conditions that they can and the best pay. And that works regardless of how fishers are paid, because one thing that is worth saying at the outset is fishing is quite around the world is usually outside of most employment norms and outside of most employment regulation to a large extent. The reason for that has been, in part, the dominance of small-scale fisheries where people aren't in employment relationships. So you don't have that same kind of level of organization because they don't have an employer and there's no one to bargain with. They just sell into local markets or to local processors. At the same time, you also have the share system, which is how fishers have traditionally been paid, where they get a share of the catch or a share of the vessel's profits rather than a day wage or an hourly rate. And that also means that they're usually sort of self-employed and outside of the normal sort of employment situation that would be of interest to trade unions, who obviously want members in collective agreements. Having said that, lots of our affiliates do have collective bargaining agreements that are based on a share system. So some, for example, in Norway or Argentina, they would have a guaranteed minimum wage and social security payments, but the vast majority of what they earn is actually through the share system because it's a production-based job. So just working as a share fisher doesn't mean that you can't be a member of a union. It doesn't mean that you can't bargain collectively with your employer. But obviously it's more complex than being a seafarer who is on a monthly wage and does a fixed number of hours, because that is the nature of a production-based wild capture industry. What has changed over the last 20 or 30 years is that fishers are not any longer mainly from the nations on which flags flagged vessels they're fishing on. So what's happened is, as fishers have got older in the global north, that could be Japan, or it could be Canada, or it could be Europe, it's harder and harder to recruit younger people into the industry, and also far more profitable if you can bring in people from the global south who will work for less, and if you can figure out a loophole to get them in, as we'll speak about specifically in terms of the UK. But yeah, the point I made before is that not all fishing jobs are equal. I mean, you could have a canoe fisher who is selling to a local market, all the way through to a unionized engineer who is working on a factory ship, and the spectrum between those two and their lived reality and their conditions of work is as big as you can find across the world's economy for different jobs, I would say. So you have employed fishers, you have self-employed fishers, you have members of unions, you have disorganized or unorganized fishers, you have nationals working on their own flag, and you also have migrant fishers. So it's a pretty complex landscape. What it all boils down to is that fishing companies, many of them, are engaged in a race to the bottom, where rather than pay locals or nationals to share, they bring in migrant workers who they can pay considerably less. The reason for that is, as I said, an aging domestic workforce, the nature of the work, it's unattractive, and also the lack of clarity around what you're going to earn. Like, if you go for a job interview here, Aldi can tell you exactly what you're going to earn every hour, whereas if you went for a job in the fishing industry, they'd say, well, it might be this or it might be that. And that's kind of a large problem when it comes to recruitment of domestic workforces, is it's basically perceived as a dangerous, difficult and dirty job, the 3Ds, but it's also one where it's not clear what you're going to earn. You have the prospect of earning quite a lot if the boat's doing well, but you also run the risk of, not earning at all if the weather's terrible or if the vessel is out of the water. So what we've seen happen globally is that in many countries, it's migrant fishers who now undertake the most dangerous and lowest paid jobs. What are the risks to migrant fishers? I mean, I'm not going to read off everything on the slide, but we see a lot of problems that come up through recruitment, where they're paying to get jobs and then they're held in debt bondage, either through money that they've had to borrow or through money that they then owe their recruiter, or that they've borrowed from friends and family or loan sharks. That can often start them into a journey of forced labor or modern slavery. Overwork is extremely common in the world's fishing industry because it's production based. So if the fishing's good, you don't sleep, you keep going because that's how you make the money. We see this systemic labor exploitation with this reliance on migrant workers who often don't have immigration status and are not protected by the flag state employment legislation. And then we also have this more difficult context where in the global north, with all of these, right-wing political parties gaining momentum, a discussion misguided to a large extent, or a false narrative around the dangers of immigration, when really it's the migrants who are actually underpinning our entire economy by doing the work that we don't want to do. So, but that sets a very difficult context for organising migrant workers as well. They're also at risk of criminalisation if the vessel owner is doing something else. It could be moving drugs around, it could be weapons, it could be human trafficking, it could be fishing without a licence or other IUU fishing. The crew doesn't make that decision, but they're obviously vulnerable to that kind of threat. Wage theft is very widespread as well, where vessel owners don't provide the correct information on the catches, so they're basically robbing workers of their wages, or they hold on to their wages for the whole fishing trip. That might be a year, it might be 2 years, and obviously over that period of time, what are their families meant to live off? Blacklisting is very widespread. That means if you complain or you raise a case with a union or with a labour inspector, that the employer then shares your name and passport details to make sure you don't get hired again. And often workers, for that reason, also have no access to grievances or remedy if they remain unpaid or they get injured at work or that kind of thing. And one of our main issues at ITF at the moment is the fact that globally there's no really strong regulation or licensing of the recruitment agents. And that's where the journey into forced labour really begins. And that's the change that we need to see. In terms of the big picture, there is no global data set on migrant fishers. The International Labour Organization is clear that fishing is one of the most hazardous occupations, but also that globally a minimum of 128,000 fishers are trapped in forced labour situations, whether that's facing isolation, debt bondage, physical abuse. it is really a very, very high risk sector. And we see that everywhere that we work outside of fisheries that are covered by collective bargaining agreements, for the obvious reasons that there you have obvious recourse, you have the protection of being part of a union, and you also then have a far higher likelihood of getting remedy because they can take on a legal case for you against the employer to ensure that you do get paid or compensated if you've been injured. The majority of the migrant fishers in the world come from Indonesia, but Philippines, Vietnam, Burma, Senegal are also countries that send a lot of workers into the global seafood supply chain, into the global catching sector. And migration is now a fundamental part of commercial fishing. If you look at Taiwan or South Korea, even China, Spain, Ireland, France, and the UK, the industry at a large scale industrial fishing. I'm not talking about small scale, one man in his boat, talking about the big industrial fleets that provide our supermarkets and canneries with throughput. All of those countries are completely reliant on migrant labor to function. Now, I spoke about recruitment and the importance of getting it right. Last year in October, we managed to negotiate a set of guidelines for the recruitment and placement of migrant fishers. It was led by the 8 countries that are listed below, and that was held in Geneva over a 5-day, 70-hour week last year in October. You can see here our workers delegation. That includes our unions from Spain and Norway, Philippines, Ivory Coast, Indonesia, Taiwan, and then our sister affiliation, which is ETF, which is the European Transport Workers Federation. The guidelines were adopted. I think they're very positive. They're non-binding on states, but they're a complement to the Work in Fishing Convention, which is ILO Convention C-188, which the UK did ratify in 2019. It's one of 25 states to have done so. But this basically sets minimum international standards for fishing. And based on what I was saying before, this is extremely important because fishing globally is really quite poorly regulated when it comes to labor and has these very high decent work deficits and this very high risk of forced labor. So C-188 is there to basically set a minimum standard in terms of having a written contract, providing medical care, having hours of work and rest that are recorded, having occupational health and safety, decent accommodation and food on board, ethical recruitment where you're not paying to get the job, and a right to repatriation at the end of your contract. All of that stuff should be, basic. I can't imagine anyone here that's joining the call is working without a contract or doesn't have an idea how many hours they're going to get paid for. But the reality is in fishing, that is a very small minority of fishers that are even reaching this point. Obviously, if you're talking about unionized fishers in Norway or Iceland or Japan or Argentina, they have collective bargaining agreements that go way, way further than this minimum standard and would cover many other aspects of work that you guys would probably recognize in your own employment contracts. Now, I said that the recruitment and placement guidelines are non-binding, but there are binding parts of C-188 when it comes to recruitment and placement. You can see here where the stars are. It basically is really, really important that workers are not paying to get the job, and that is already in the convention. It also says that the states that ratify the convention should have systems of licensing and regulation of agents. And while the UK government was very forthright, they were the vice chair position for the countries, like the nation states represented at the ILO, and they took a really strong position, very worker-friendly position in developing these guidelines, which was great. But the sad fact of the matter is that nothing that's in the guidelines is happening in the UK yet. And if anyone's interested, I could walk you through a presentation that I gave specifically about the guidelines at some other point. So I was also asked to explain a bit about what consumers in the UK eat and what we actually produce. Now, these are the top 5 species. They could be 90% or more of what UK consumers consume, but the only one that's listed there that is caught to a large extent within UK waters by the UK fleet and then consumed here is haddock, because the others are tuna, usually tropical, prawns, usually from aquaculture, salmon, usually from aquaculture, and cod. Following a regime shift, the cod is now all further north, and most of our fish and chips comes from Iceland and Norway. So those big 5 really represent what we eat, but we produce a whole raft of different species which is very, very valued and prized around the world. But we export 80% of what we catch, and that could be our pelagic species like mackerel, or it could be our demersal or shellfish species like nephrops, for example, or scallops, which we produce a huge amount of, but really hardly any of it is eaten here, which makes it quite difficult from a supply chain traceability point of view, because if it goes straight in a truck, and then off to China, it's not quite the same as if it ends up in a UK supermarket. So that is a mismatch, and that's also part of the reason why seafood trade remains such an essential issue after Brexit, because we obviously wrote ourselves out of being able to trade directly with the EU. And in becoming a third country, the standards have all changed. And if we're an export-reliant fishery, then that's obviously something that is going to continue to create problems for producers. Now, sorry, nearly there. So when it comes to the labour force in the UK, we also, over the last 20 years, have experienced the same labour shortage and this reliance on migrant workers. They started from the Philippines, but since then, Ghana is now the biggest group, but also Sri Lankan and Indian workers. ITF has been doing casework for the last 5 years, recovering owed wages, reporting accidents that weren't reported, preventing deportation and bans into the country, and arranging repatriation for workers at the end of their contract if their employer fails to do it. I've also been involved in the repatriation of bodies for fishers who died while at work here in the UK, which is a sad reality of this industry as well. Most of these migrant workers are in the Scottish whitefish fleet, in the Scampi or Nephrops fleet in Northern Ireland and Scotland, and in the offshore scallop fleet, which is a nomadic fishery really from the North Sea, the English Channel and the Irish Sea, and also up in Scotland, and they move around on a seasonal basis until the catch per unit effort drops, and then they move on. So those are the really dominant ones in terms of migrant fishers. As Oska will speak about, this has all come around through the misuse of a seafarer's transit stamp. And I was pleased to say that in 2023, ITF shamed the Home Office into bringing in a skilled worker visa requirement for all those vessels that fish within UK waters, but it didn't deal with the substantive issue of what is going on outside UK waters on UK flagged vessels. To shame the Home Office, obviously you need to have a lot of media exposure. So I took a lot of anonymized cases to the press over a 2-year period to basically bring in government, civil servants and supply chain actors to try to actually change the situation, which is fair to say in most of those fleets that I mentioned, which is systemic labour exploitation of migrants being absolutely essential to that industry, which obviously can't go on. UK fleet or UK employment wise, there's around 11,000 fishers, over 5,000 vessels, landing over £1 billion of seafood every year. 80% of the vessels are small scale. In the UK, that means 10 meters. That's the cut-off point. And they largely now fish for shellfish. The UK used to have a big distant water fleet fishing in Iceland, Icelandic waters, but then when they had their Brexit moment and took back control, we were excluded from that, and our distant water fleet died a death. Lots of the vessels were decommissioned. The money was reinvested into smaller vessels that focus a lot on shellfish. So if you go to your local fishing port, you'll probably see small shellfish boats specialized in whelks, exporting to South Korea, not controlled by quota, or crabs and lobsters often exported to China, for example, also not quoted. The large-scale fleet is way fewer vessels. They hold all of the quotas since that was privatized in 1999. They mainly fish for pelagic species and whitefish. And really, it's fair to say that Scotland, for its size and population, dominates UK fishing. It's around 40% of fishers are up in Scotland, and around 70% of the economic output is generated there. The biggest ones are the pelagic species, herring mackerel and blue whiting, which goes into aquafeed. So Scotland itself has 2,000 vessels, about 3/4 of them are under 10s. So we're really only talking about around 500 vessels that are the recruiting migrant fishers, and only 26 of the vessels are over 40 meters. So those would be the big pelagic factory ships that cost sort of 40 million quid upwards. Since quota was privatized, there's been a huge concentration, obviously, of quota and therefore wealth and therefore capital and investment into really quite a few fishing families. It's effectively an oligarchy by accident. Now, in terms of evidence from the UK, we worked a lot with an academic called Dr. Jess Sparks in 2022, and then Flex came on board and have been great in terms of providing additional evidence. But we started in 2022-23. ITF, well, I produced a paper explaining what the transit loophole is, and then shortly after that, a survey of over 200 migrant fishers was launched by the Rights Lab, which showed how they were being overworked, paid nowhere near minimum wage. It was around £3 an hour, suffering recruitment debt, violence and harassment on board, discrimination, and basically a culture of fear when it comes to reporting grievances. And we basically mapped out the indicators of forced labour. The ILO has 11 forced labour indicators, and we saw that between 8 and 10 of those indicators were present in almost all of the cases we looked at. So this loophole, which Oska is going to speak about, is the starting point for these risks. They limit workers' rights and they discourage complaints and also increase the likelihood of blacklisting. I've got a set of recommendations here, but that's probably best for the discussion at the end. I mean, I think my overriding point really is that sustainability so often just focuses on the environmental resource and not on the labour force, and that in itself is a huge problem. So with that, hopefully that was within 20 minutes, and I'll pass over to Oska.
Thank you very much, Chris. Okay, let me just share my screen now. Okay, is that visible? Great. Okay, so yeah, thanks, Chris, for that. That was a really, I think, helpful, broad, global view of what's going on. And he mentioned a few times this Code 7 transit stamp, or as we call it, the transit loophole, which I'm going to explain in more detail now. Diana at the start mentioned who we are, but just to quickly recap, Flex is a research and policy organization that aims to really, it looks at the ways that the immigration rules and regulations can kind of facilitate or make people particularly vulnerable to labor exploitation. And we do this through kind of evidence-based research and then developing policy and legislative change. We also convene some groups and work with government, trade unions, businesses, and civil society. And we don't just look at fishing, we look at a variety of kind of high-risk, low-income sectors, such as cleaning, agriculture, construction, and fishing. So what I'm going to speak about today is research that was conducted by my colleague who's in this chat, Oliver, and his team. Looking really, it was kind of, there's two reports. The first kind of is a legal analysis and review of the immigration pathways and employment rights and protections that migrant fishers have on UK flag vessels. And the second one was a more kind of qualitative study, I suppose, which involved interviews with fishers and also stakeholders, exploring kind of the outcomes of these legal this legal framework. So the conditions that people have to work in, how they can actually access any rights and protections, and more generally just their experiences on board UK flagged vessels. So I'll go through these quite quickly because I think a lot of it was covered by Chris, but as you said, there's been like a big decline in the domestic workforce, which includes in the UK. And this is driven by a number of interconnected factors, which he also mentioned, such as the aging workforce. It's a kind of very demanding and dangerous job, limited kind of career progression. As Chris mentioned, like really quite a lot of obscurity around how much you're actually going to get paid. And if you compare this to other employment sectors, it's often not what people choose to go into. Sorry, it's not letting me. Yeah. So for the last kind of 30 years or so, the British fishing industry has relied on migrant workers, and they've tended to recruit from low-income countries with maritime experience. So often these are Asian countries like the Philippines or Ghana. So basically, any other countries which the kind of workforce already has experience. The issue is that there has never really been any appropriate immigration framework to employ fishers in the UK. Um, and so vessel owners have tended to rely on this Code 7 transit stamp, or the transit loophole, which I'm going to explain in detail now. So basically, the immigration rules, Immigration Act of 1971, there's a provision in that which allows seafaring crew to temporarily transit through the UK, and so they don't need an actual visa. So this is kind of intended also for like people working on cruise ships, for example. So you arrive in the UK, you have a couple of days layover, and then you get on board a vessel and you leave the UK again. Um, and they have this for seamen as well, who arrive and then leave and leave UK waters. So it's recorded, or is known as, a number of different things. So contract seaman leave is how the Home Office sometimes referred to it. It's recorded by the Home Office as Code 7 stamp, and in the industry it's widely known as a transit visa. So already this kind of like ambiguity about what to call this leave kind of signals the ambiguity around how it's used, really. Um, the idea is that it's, yeah, granted to a person who's arriving in the UK, and they're leaving within a reasonable period. Yeah, reasonable period. So yeah, again, there's some ambiguity around what reasonable period means. So this is before 2023. And they also said that it applies to, this is before 2023, and this advocacy that Chris was talking about, but it meant that people could be working wholly or largely outside of the UK 12 nautical mile limit. So that basically means, because it's this transit visa, the idea is that you get on the boat and you leave the UK waters, but the Home Office added for some reason this kind of ambiguity of wholly or largely outside of the UK territorial waters, which obviously had significant repercussions, because basically it created this legal fiction that migrant fishers are merely transiting through the UK, even though they're employed on UK flagged vessels. These vessels are registered in UK companies, and they're often actually working in UK territorial waters. So the kind of idea behind the law is that people should be outside of the territorial limit. However, they're already on UK vessels, they're registered for UK companies, and more often than not, they actually work within UK territorial waters, which might include fishing, but it also includes things like, unloading catches, loading supplies, maintaining equipment, preparing the gear, and then also other kind of random tasks that captains expect sometimes their workers to do, which could include something like renovating an apartment, or anything really on UK land. So clearly they're working in the UK. So this idea that they're just transiting through the UK is really completely made up. So yeah, in the Nationality and Borders Act, there was a kind of change of policy which said that basically the people on this thing could not, they removed this wholly or largely clause, basically, so people could only work outside of UK territorial waters, and anybody who's working within the UK would need to be recruited through the UK immigration points-based system. But although this did definitely improve the situation, there are many reasons why vessel owners continued to rely on the loophole. And here are some of the kind of the eligibility requirements and kind of different barriers between the skilled worker visa. So with the skilled worker visa, there needs to be English proficiency. With the transit loophole, there's no such requirement. There's a minimum salary threshold of 41,000 per year with the skilled worker visa. Again, with the transit loophole, there's no requirement. Application costs vary really significantly, and also there's no immigration health surcharge. So basically, even though that this kind of route was offered, it meant that most people, many people, still relied on this loophole. And at the end of this year, actually, the skilled worker visa framework is actually going to kind of become even more, or basically non-applicable. So there's something called an immigration salary list, which is professions which have a kind of shortage, and then the employer sponsorship can be at 20% below the standard, so 20% below the 41,000. And this is for specific occupations. There were a number of fishing occupations added to the immigration salary list. And it's estimated that around 20 to 40% of migrant fishers were employed via this route. However, it's set to be abolished at the end of this year. So that kind of route is going to close completely. There's going to be a new framework, which is basically very similar, called the temporary shortage list in 2027, but this currently includes no fishing occupations. So basically, next year there's going to be no real way for people to enter legally, and the sectors are going to become more reliant on the transit loophole, and that's because all of the eligibility requirements really for the skilled worker visa are either inaccessible, or they just don't need to be applied because the vessel owner can just go for the loophole. Yeah, Chris mentioned some of the risks that this is creating, but I'll run through them again. So basically, the first main thing is that these fishers don't have a formal immigration status in the UK, despite working in the UK. And that creates, countless issues. So one is that they don't have any access to labour protections and rights. Another is that if they are caught in the UK, like fishing in the UK waters even, they face removal or deportation. They can face criminal prosecution, and they might be prohibited from returning to the UK if they're not blacklisted by the companies themselves. And also their labour is completely overlooked. And from our research, basically, we found that there's just, because they don't have any kind of formal legal protections, the level of like abuse, I suppose, is just so high. People are getting paid as little as like £3 an hour, expected to work for like hours and hours at a time, for days at a time, for months at a time. There's just no real regulation around people who are working. And there's also a difference between who's employed via, say, the skilled worker visa, who's a domestic, like a British citizen worker, and who's employed via this legal loophole scheme. They could be doing exactly the same job and getting completely different working conditions, completely different salaries, and so on. So one example that you might have seen recently in the news, relates to kind of between 2012 and 2020. There were 35 victims who were recognized by the Home Office as victims of modern slavery and human trafficking operated by a company called TN Trawlers. And in June 2026, just recently, basically the captain of the boat was charged with failing to kind of meet the maritime health and safety regulations for 5 of these men, and this included failing to provide adequate food, rest, training, safe working conditions, and appropriate working patterns. And some of the workers reported degrading treatment and abuse, including being referred to as slaves, bearing in mind that these workers were from Ghana. The TN Group has denied these allegations relating to modern slavery and human trafficking. So this is quite significant that these charges were for health and safety. They weren't for modern slavery, human trafficking. And the company has continued to recruit migrant fishers via the loophole throughout this period. So yeah, here are some of the other risks that I mentioned. So yeah, workers being paid as little as £3.67 an hour, really high dependency on employers and what employers choose for them to do. So like where they choose for them to fish. Also, as Chris said, there could be other things going on, like trafficking of drugs or firearms on the boats. Insecure working contracts, excessive hours. There's a really high risk of injury in a lot of these jobs, and because people don't have like the permission to be in the UK, they often don't have access to hospitals. There's also lots of uncertainty around their rights and whether they'll be criminalized if they're caught. operating in UK waters. And then, as I mentioned before, there's also these massive pay discrepancies depending on what form of leave you're employed under. So, we're obviously dealing with like a really high risk sector with kind of lots and lots of issues at play. And the government is really aware of quite a lot of these issues, and they're being rather kind of opaque about it. So there's no data recorded by the Home Office for the number of people who are employed by this transit loophole. And we've made a number of freedom of information requests. And the responses we've got to that have ranged from we don't have the data or we don't record the data to the data is not in the public interest for this data to be shared. So it feels like there's a kind of, there's a deliberateness around the data not being made public, I suppose. The government has also kind of like spoken about how the focus needs to be on improving the domestic recruitment, which is a bit of a red herring in many ways, because at the moment the domestic workforce can't compete with a migrant workforce because they can just be employed on such lower standards. So why would a kind of a fishing vessel owner employ somebody who has to pay decent salary and meet all the labor protections when they can just employ a workforce which has no protections at all? So we have mentioned these issues before to government, and with Lord Watson, he tabled an amendment to the previous immigration bill, which requested a review of the transit loophole by the government. So looking at the scale of its use, so like trying to get an idea of the number of people who are employed via this framework, what implication this has for workers' rights, and then also to kind of propose an alternative solution. Back when we made that amendment, the government's response was, as I've written here, it would be inappropriate to give work rights to those on temporary visas intending to allow transit only. So this is kind of a deliberate misunderstanding of what we're asking for. And as we've seen now, people are not in transit only. This is a kind of fiction which is used to distract from the real issues. So the final thing I want to talk about is what we are proposing. And as you probably know, there's a current immigration and asylum bill, and we'll be tabling this as part of that. But it's to propose a sector-specific fishing visa. So because of all the kind of complexities of the fishing industry that Chris mentioned, we think that a specific sector-wide sponsor model would be the best suited for reducing dependency on individual employers, so on individual vessel owners. Also to recognise, which is the most important, to recognise migrant fishers as workers in the UK, given that they're working on UK-flagged vessels for UK companies and often in and out of UK territorial waters. It would also provide a lawful and sustainable route for the recruitment of workers from around the world. And again, would provide for their employment rights and protections, and would just address this kind of reliance on these, 50-year-old legal loopholes and temporary fixes that just enables, labor exploitation to be so rife in this industry. And ultimately, the aim is to stop this kind of highly racialized two-tier employment system whereby certain people can be exploited like completely indiscriminately and heavily while others, have UK protections, which also means that vessel owners tend to just go for the cheap, more exploitable labor. So yeah, that's everything. There's two reports that Oliver and his team have written, Unraveling the Nets, which is the kind of legal analysis document, which goes into more detail around all of these legal frameworks that I've just described. And then the second one is the Voices from the Decks, which is the more qualitative study. So you can find those on our websites if you are interested. And that is everything from me.
Thank you so much, Oska and Chris. That was amazing from both of you. Thank you so much. I know I asked you to do a lot of things in 20 minutes, so really appreciative, whatever, however you pronounce that, of that. Yeah, just incredibly interesting and infuriating, but really great that we're having these conversations. And I think that we'll be able to include some of this information in the atlas. So I'd like to open it up for any questions, reflections, yeah, to anyone who might want to ask something or reflect something back to our speakers. Neil?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I suppose it just really reinforces as a part of our Fish Plus work and also as part of our procurement in the public sector, is that we should be using as much locally caught stuff as possible and having more traceability about exactly who's involved in catching that fish. But I suppose my question would go back to the two presenters and just what could Scotland do to make sure that we are in a better situation in terms of making sure we're thinking about workers' rights who are unseen at the minute from government or from consumers, I suppose. What would be the 2 or 3 things that we could possibly use through public sector procurement or through the Good Food Nation Act? What are some of the tools that would be useful?
I can start. I think that like I guess the more support we get around like kind of civil society support, industry support, and political support around the idea of this being something that needs to be addressed and talking about is something that can happen. So yeah, raising awareness like amongst local politicians, but that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, and that I mean Scotland has also proposed a fishing visa before and it was rejected by the UK government. So there is a kind of acknowledgement within Scotland that this is something that needs to change, right? So I think, yeah, in terms of so long as this legal loophole exists, there's going to be this level of exploitation. So I think that's really where the focus has to be. But I don't know what you think, Chris.
Thanks, and thanks for the question. Yeah, I could draw a sort of some parallels with what happened in the Republic of Ireland. So ITF campaigned on this very similar issue in Ireland. What was happening there is that the fleet was reliant mainly on undocumented workers, originally from Egypt, but then they also started bringing in crew from the Philippines, Ghana, and Indonesia. So a slightly different makeup of the labour sending countries. But our campaign there, we brought cases to the authorities, we did work with the media, we organised migrant workers. And in the end, we were successful and we managed to change the legislation. The Irish government brought in a system whereby if you come in to work in the Irish fleet, you get protection of Irish minimum wage, you get Irish employment rights, and you have, importantly, full labour market access, which means if you don't want to work in fishing anymore after a period of time, you can move into construction or whatever other industry. What's really interesting about what happened in Ireland is the Irish government also set up a quota system so that the Irish fishing industry could draw, I think it was 130 migrant fishers per year. Now, when that came in, they only recruited 2 through that legal channel. So what that tells you is that the vessel owners in Ireland, it's a labour crisis. It's a labour crisis. We can't find any workers. We can't find any workers. But then when there's a legal system that allows workers in but gives them minimum wage protections, the vessel owners don't want to pay. So that's, I think, what we've got to bear that in mind, that this is systemic labour exploitation to be profitable or to be super profitable. So it's a lie to say that they can't recruit domestically. Quite often when we've worked with the authorities to shut down some of these vessels and have the crew voluntarily removed so that they don't have an adverse immigration history, the vessels back out at sea the next day with Brits on board. I mean, it's not that hard for them to do it. They just don't want to, because if you have to pay someone a share, that's probably between 40 and 70 grand a year, whereas on a Code 7 you can get away with £1 grand a month. So let's be honest about it. This is a financial thing that the industry is doing. It's a race to the bottom. And it is the biggest barrier to domestic recruitment, because who the hell is going to pay someone 70 grand when you can get away with 12? So that's one thing. And when it really comes down to it, I have to say, I think the hostile environment, and this is parallel to lots of other countries we're working in and very similar issues. A report was released about the United States just this morning where a similar thing happens. They bring in Filipinos through Mexico or through Canada who don't have a work visa for the States, but then magically just appear and work on these vessels. So I mean, this is happening everywhere. It happens in the Korean fleet, in the Japanese fleet. This is not uncommon. So it's not, the UK is not the only country that needs to try and reform this. My personal view is we need to get recruitment right. The UK government has centered their work on these recruitment and placement guidelines. It has ratified the Work and Fishing Convention. It has no reason to not follow through on the regulation and licensing of agents. I think in a hostile environment, I don't think that a visa is likely, although, as Oska says, it's something the industry also want because they want a legal channel. However, they don't want to pay a skilled worker wage if they can get away with it, because it's 34 grand a year and they've got very used to paying 12 or less. So I think we need to think about it from a financial point of view as well, because that's really the root of this. Having said that, I know that up in Fraserburgh they've got a state-of-the-art training centre that was funded by these new the coastal scheme that's replaced the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, and they ran a course up there the other day. Could have had 30 people on it. It had 3. One was from Seafish, just finding out about the course. One was the son of a fisherman who would go into fishing anyway, and the other guy left after lunch. So I mean, there is a problem with recruitment, but a large part of it is the pay system. If you could say a share fisherman owns 70 grand, tell me what 18-year-old in a marginalized coastal community wouldn't consider it. If you say we can't tell you what you're going to earn, and in reality we've got a workforce working on 40 quid a day, then they're playing a double game. They're saying that we can't recruit domestically, but the truth is they can't recruit domestically at a wage that they want to pay to be extremely profitable. And that's that's the other aspect. So I think, what can you guys do? Well, we're here to basically raise awareness of the issue. There are various aspects of the campaign that demand further support. And as I said in the presentation, Scotland is really the centre of this, just because of how important the fishing industry is in relative terms. I mean, it's only really Aberdeenshire and parts of Cornwall where even 20% of the population have jobs and livelihoods that link to fishing. So we need to think about this in terms of like where the main ports are, where this happens, but we also need to think about it in terms of like the wider policy change, because at present, Oska said a 2-tier system, it's a 3-tier system. You can be doing the same job for the same company, you can be on a share, you can be a skilled worker, or you could be a code 7. And the difference between their treatment, their entitlements, their employment rights and their pay is absolutely huge. It's nearly a factor of 4. So, I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It's inbuilt discrimination. And we have various conventions in this country and various flag state rules that mean that these workers should be treated the same. So there's no excuse for it other than political inertia. And that's why you need organizations to kind of champion this issue and work it into all of their campaigns as well.
Thank you both. Leonie?
Hi, well, that was quite an insight. Thanks very much to you both for that. Can you tell us if the Marine Stewardship Council take account of these things in any way at all, and whether you're convinced by, whatever standards they apply? And also, I just did happen to notice in Tesco that they have a note on some of their cans of sardines saying that they take account of fishers' rights. Is that persuasive at all to you?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. I mean, no and no. I'm just going to post a link in the chat to some global research that we published earlier this year, where we overlaid the cases that the ITF Fishers Support Network has dealt with globally in the last 5 years, and overlaid them in a very laborious and difficult way over vessels that are on the vessel list that are available, because not all of them are, for MSC certified fisheries. And we found a large number of cases. MSC kind of said, oh, it's only 2% of our vessels. But the reality is we only looked at cases that our inspectors have handled. If you went back to the port state control authorities, unions in those countries, or some NGOs and legal teams that support migrant fishers, you would see that what we've uncovered is basically just the tip of the iceberg. MSC play a double game again. They like to say it's sustainability, but then whenever they're questioned about labour rights, they say, well, we've got a no child labour, no forced labour entrance policy. But that is just a self-assessment, and it relies on an impossibly high threshold of basically a prosecution for forced labour, which could take years. I mean, even in the UK, you're looking at 2.5 to 3 years for these cases to come to court. So if you already had your, frozen haddock or tin of tuna on the shelf, what is MSC realistically proposing to do about it? So we have a campaign against MSC as part of the Seafood Working Group with Global Labour Justice, Solidarity Centre, and some environmental NGOs, because we want them to publicly step away from that convenient assumption that sustainability includes human and labour rights, which it certainly doesn't. But I would, if you read that report, it'll lay it out in much more detail. The ITF has a policy against voluntary standards and third-party certifications because they are complete and utter bullshit. There's nothing that basically guarantees workers' rights that any company can basically pay a consultancy to establish for them. You can't buy that in a label. The way you ensure that people's rights are being respected is through collective bargaining agreements that protect those rights in a legally binding way. So it's a complete fantasy. It's for the birds, and lots of parallel initiatives have propped up, and they claim to protect workers' rights, but I mean, it's a complete and utter fantasy. And I think lots of those labels are basically made for retailers and buyers. They're not really made for workers, and they're not even really made for consumers, because if a consumer sees a tick on something, it thinks that someone else has done the hard work for them, and the reality is they haven't.
Thank you, Chris. Rosie?
Thanks both for really interesting talks there. I think it's a really important dimension of fishing that, sometimes is missed out of those conversations. I wondered whether, so you'd mentioned that Scotland had proposed a fishing visa in the past. I wondered when that was, and also if you engage much with Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government, including around like processes. So for instance, like the fisheries management plans have been up for consultation recently, and I wondered whether like that was an avenue you engaged in, or some of those other sort of Scottish Government work streams. Yeah, I just wondered what, if any, engagement you had with Scotland looked like on that front. Thank you.
I mean, yes, obviously links into Scottish Parliament are going to be really important for this. If I was working on this full time, I think that's what I would spend most of my time doing. But the reality is we're, dealing with similar issues to this in almost every country that has a fishing industry. So there hasn't been a concerted political campaign. We're doing a lot of work through the all-party parliamentary group and through various different sort of umbrella organizations, and also working with retailers in the Sea Alliance and the Ethical Trade Initiative to try and get some of the kind of money that is, that I think government takes more note of. If like really big supermarkets and retailers show concern, that's obviously going to trigger more of a response in government than what the ITF says. So we're trying to do it in the most efficient way through those kind of umbrella groups. We did read some of the fisheries management plans as they were coming out. I have sent to DEFRA and to some of the authorities our thoughts on it, because it's completely deranged that the social dimension of these fisheries doesn't include labour. I mean, it's like benefits to coastal communities and all these sort of contrived things, whereas in the first instance, what are we actually talking about in terms of the social dimension? It's work, and it should be decent work, and it should be equal treatment for equal work, so an equal pay fundamentally. So I think the government is being willfully blind to this as part of fisheries management. But I mean, if you can't regulate labour in a fishery, then what the hell do you think you're going to, achieve going forward, sort of sustainability wise? I think it's really misguided, and those fisheries management plans have, to my mind, been extremely poor.
Oska, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I was going to say that also, like, in centralised government, we've had a few Scottish MPs who are interested, and obviously, like, a lot of the industry is there, and there has been support. And hopefully for the new amendment that we're going to make, that we're going to have like some MPs supporting it from Scotland. I can't remember exactly when the Scottish Parliament was, but I can send you like information on that afterwards if you want. I would also just add to what Chris was saying, is that yeah, it's definitely like a financial reason behind all of this, and there's also like in the context of the hostile environment, like none of these people get recorded as being in the UK. So, and there's no data on it. So part of the reason is also to keep this kind of net migration numbers low, because if people were suddenly being employed in legal ways, they would have to be recorded. And then suddenly the government has however many people there are more on their books. So it's all part of the kind of political game. It's in the benefit of like these big fishing companies. It's in the benefit of the government to keep this kind of like, yeah, Chris said it's like a hidden workforce, but it's very well known that this workforce exists and it's kind of purposefully get hidden. So I think that's yeah, something important to add as well.
If I could just come in quickly to add something else, it's also because the policy was developed as a knee-jerk response to being shamed by the ITF, it's not what we were actually asking for. They did what they thought was going to be deliverable. So Suella Braverman basically said, well, we've got skilled workers in agriculture and in other sectors. Let's just do the same in fishing. It's easier, it's consistent. But obviously that doesn't make sense in terms of how fishing works and the fact that, you know, most vessels are able to operate inside or outside the 12-mile limit. It's a bit arbitrary. However, it's not arbitrary when it comes to certain species that are sedentary. So if you're fishing for prawns or nephrops or longestine, whatever you want to call it, those are found in muddy habitats in particular places. It's not like, you know, chasing massive shoals of mackerel or herring. So the problem is this policy has also created winners and losers on a regional basis. If you're in Fraserburgh or Peterhead, you can be outside UK waters very, very quickly. If you're in the islands and highlands where the 12-mile limit starts again from every island, it basically is much harder. And again, if the grounds that you mainly fish are in UK waters, you're paying, you know, 30 grand a pop for your worker, whereas someone that can go 1 mile further out can still get away with paying £1 a month. So it's also a poorly thought through policy in terms of it doesn't apply to the whole industry. So the Northern Irish fleet, which is considerably less profitable than the Scottish large scale 24-meter plus fleet, is now completely stumped because they don't have the workforce and they're having to pay skilled workers, i.e. in line with UK minimum wage, whereas the Scottish fleet that is doing far better than them financially can still get away with built-in labour exploitation. So it's a poorly designed policy on every level, and that is because it's a knee-jerk policy that the government said to the industry, we're going to do this for 2 years, you need to come up with a solution. The industry hasn't done anything. They just keep kicking the can down the road. Can we have an exemption? Can we have a delay? Can you suspend this for another year? They haven't, and they means them and Seafish and all of the bodies that are basically meant to be dealing with domestic recruitment. They've spent 10 million quid over the last decade, and how many young apprentices who are Brits have they pulled through the ranks? Bugger all. So the problem really is a lack of foresight, and they're just going to keep chancing it and kicking the can down the road. But when the skilled worker visa requirement is dropped at the end of December of this year, we're going to be in a very, very different situation because they're not going to be able to fill all of those roles with domestic crew because the fishing grounds to a large extent for certain species are fixed and are within UK waters. So again, the supply chain, we want them to take action because if you think about something like scampi, that is the one fishery where it is all of the basically the majority of Europe's quota has always been in the UK. That is a UK caught, UK processed, UK sold and consumed fishery. Like the rest of Europe, they're not interested in scampi. They're eating our crab and whelks and whatever else, cuttlefish. So we need to look at some key fisheries, and there's just been a big Seafish funded human rights impact assessment looking at scallops and nephrops, which are probably the two worst. But Seafish, although the report was finished in May, haven't published it yet, which I think is quite suspicious. Which basically outlines all of these issues that we've been banging on about for the last 5 years. And because that is Seafish funded, that will hopefully lead to a new kind of intergovernmental policy development. But I don't think that anyone is ready for the cliff edge in December. So the only option is going to be if you need to fish inside UK waters, you need to extend those skilled workers for 3 to 5 years, because otherwise you're going to go down the pan.
Oska, do you want to come in?
Yeah, if there's no other question, I was just going to add about this kind of this trick that they're using in terms of like focusing on the domestic workforce while allowing this allowing this other kind of route to exist without any intention of closing it. It's also like we also need to bear in mind the kind of like classist discussions that come with that in terms of like around the domestic workforce and being like, oh, but they don't want to take these jobs, and this kind of like expectation that, you know, young working class people should take these jobs, and that's the reason why this is failing. And at the same time having this like highly racialized, impoverished workforce being being facilitated into conditions which often lead to modern slavery and human trafficking. So yeah, it's also there's lots of like kind of domestic class politics also involved in this system.
Thank you, Oska. Leonie?
Yeah, thanks, Deanna. Does the Scottish oligarchy have a disproportionate lobby voice in all this? And if so, what should be done about that?
I'm happy to take that one. I mean, yes, and over many years, you can actually see, even just within Seafish, they have a very disproportionate lobbying voice. So the catching sector is basically always the tail that's wagging the dog, to some extent, because Seafish really is levy funded. So it's the big processors and importers that really are making the biggest financial contribution. But you can see how disproportionate it is if you look at what happened in the Brexit debate, for example. It all became about catching. We can get more quota, we can take back control, we can do all of this stuff. The reality is, at that point, 70% of the processing jobs were Eastern European. So we lost all of those jobs. A large percentage of these Filipinos and Ghanaians are filling in jobs that Poles and Latvians and Bulgarians were doing before, who've gone home since Brexit. So, but if you look at the discussions around fishing, processing, importing, exporting, all of the bivalve shellfish, none of that got into the news because it was all just like the catching sector and this big sort of overinflated opportunity, what could you say, optimism about what Brexit could do. And the government is often quite reluctant to basically challenge some of that, because also the people that speak for the industry are only speaking for their own vessel owner federations. They're not speaking for the little guy in some like Cornish cove. It's just complete and utter nonsense. And the reason these oligarchs have been able to get that much power was through a very poorly managed privatization of quota. So instead of basically saying you can have the quota for 5 years, you need to pay 5% as a levy to the government, which we're going to use for fisheries management, and then in 5 years we'll review it. The UK government literally gave away those rights to the large scale sector, disenfranchised all the small scale fishermen, forcing them to fish for non-quota species, which those themselves are now overfished. And in doing that, they basically gave them all of the assets which they've used to recapitalize their industry, get some really high catch capacity, big vessels, increase that furthermore. And then they've used that to set up crewing agencies, to set up guard duty vessels for the wind farms and the oil and gas platform. And by now it's like they're leasing the quota, they own the guard contracts, they do the crewing. I mean, it's they have a disproportionate amount of political power, given that most fishermen don't recognize them as their representatives. Maybe the Scottish Fishermen's Federation is a little different because Scotland didn't sell its quota outside of Scotland. But if you look at England, like the NFFO is basically run by Icelandic, Spanish, and Dutch quota interests. It's got bugger all to do with an average English fisher. Scotland is slightly different because they kept the quota within Scotland because they have the potential to actually catch it rather than lease it out. But yes, they have a disproportionate. I mean, could you imagine the Brexit debate being about the sit-down lawnmower or locks and hinges industry or Peppa Pig merchandise? It's stupid. It's £1 billion industry. There's loads of other industries that are that size that never get any sort of political clout or headlines, and there's other industries that are 10 times bigger than that also don't. So, I mean, they punch above their weight, but unfortunately, it's being misused to basically further the interests of a very small handful of people.
Thank you, Chris. And any other questions or reflections from anyone in the call? No? Okay. Is there any, I don't know, any one last message that you would want, Chris or Oska, that you think maybe should be part of this Fish Plus Atlas that we're producing? Chris?
Yeah, I think just that any environmental organizations just take on board what we've gone through and make sure that for your part of the work that you're doing, that this isn't an invisible issue. And as Oska shared lots of the links that the Flex team have worked on, I've tried to put some in there to give you a perspective of what the industry says about these visa changes. But I think it's just to, at every opportunity, ensure that this is captured and don't make the mistakes of government that I think to a large extent are also deliberate. So we'll produce a big plan and we just won't mention this thing, and then we don't have to do anything about it. We don't have to measure it. We don't have to fund it. We don't have to figure out these the complicated solutions to these problems we've created. So I would just say, like, please champion this issue. Don't think that you can't talk about human and labor rights just because you work for an environmental organization. You don't have to claim to represent these workers. That would obviously be dangerous and completely misguided. But you can highlight the fact that this is a reality of the fishing industry in the various different fora that you work.
Thank you, Chris. Oska?
Yeah, I think I would just reiterate that in terms of, all of these things intersect and overlap with each other. And, environmental issues are also often workers' rights issues, as this kind of fishing industry demonstrates. And yeah, the more that this can be spoken about, I agree with Chris. I don't think this is like incompetence or like a mistake. I think this is like a deliberate system that's been put in place for a number of reasons that we've outlined. And we shouldn't give the powers that be in the government the kind of pass to be like, oh, they haven't had time to sort this out, they don't understand the issues or whatever it is. This is everybody knows about this who's close to the industry or is close to the kind of areas of power which could be changed, and they're not being changed for a number of reasons. But yeah, I guess collectively it seems like, yeah, we all have a voice, and we can all kind of put pressure on our local politicians, on the central government, and hopefully, yeah, this can at some point change.
Thank you, Oska.
Can I
go for it, Chris.
Yes, if I could just make one last point that Oska just prompted me. I mean, the previous government, it's very, very clear that they know, and the fishing industry have let them know, that they let them down when it came to Brexit. Boris Johnson promised three things: repatriation of quota, an exclusive 12-mile limit, and frictionless trade. And they failed to deliver any aspect of any of those three. So they completely stuffed the industry. So I think, in my own cynical brain, and I've got no proof for this, but it seems obvious, providing them the opportunity to exploit migrant labor and to turn a blind eye to it is a bit of a compensation for their fuck up around Brexit. So I would say that's the reason. It's not, as exactly as Oska said, it's not just inertia and everything else. It's just like, well, how can we keep the industry a bit happy given that we've just completely done them in? However, now we've got a new government and a new prime minister, whatever you think about that process. But I think we need to start that campaign again in earnest, because the previous government were incompetent and xenophobic to the nth degree. So I think we've got a good chance now to have a slightly different conversation with a government with a slightly different outlook, although what the Home Secretary to date has said is not particularly encouraging on any level. But I think we've got a better opportunity now than we had in the previous sort of 14 years.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Both of you, Chris and Oska, as I said, incredibly informative, super helpful, and I'm sure it'll just be great information to have in the Atlas. And Olivia and I will probably be reaching out to you asking for more data and stats and information, if that's okay. And for everyone else who attended, we'll send the recording out. And Chris and Oska, if you're okay with us sharing your presentations as well, great. We'll do that too, and we'll have other webinars coming up. So if you want to keep learning more about aquatic foods and all the different dimensions that are involved in it, sign up to the new Nourish newsletter, and yeah, you'll get a chance to learn a lot more. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today, and I hope you have a really good day wherever you are.
Thank you.